right. Thanks for being here today. I think once again I've met most of you except Bianca. Um, so thanks for being here. Uh, if you've been to these sessions before, you're probably used to my land acknowledgements at this point. Um, so I just, before we get started, want to acknowledge the land that we're on today. I'm in London, so I'm going to talk about where I am. Um, Being in London, being a settler in London means that I'm on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, the Napiwak, and Attawandaron peoples. So on a map, you would see the United Nation of the Thames, the Chippewa Nation, and the Munsee Delaware Nation. The people who live in those communities didn't just like end up there. They were pushed into those spaces and onto that particular section of land due to colonial practices of displacement and dispossession. One thing I want to talk a little bit about is just how important it is that we is, well, I say we, when I say we, I mean like settlers, are comfortable with being uncomfortable, or as much as I know that is an oxymoron, but sitting in discomfort and swimming in discomfort. Reminded of that. I don't know if you were following in Quebec. There was a something in the legislature yesterday that was supposed to, it was called Joyce's Principle. It was supposed to address racism in healthcare because Joyce Eshikon died and like recorded essentially a great deal of racism from healthcare staff around her death. And the Quebec legislature opted not to pass the principle yesterday because it would have required them to acknowledge systemic racism as a Canadian issue. And so that's a very clear leadership and policy position that I think is something that we all have to, not that particular decision, although similar decisions come up all of the time. But it really, to me, reads as like a failing of, or an unwillingness to grapple with our own complicity in certain structures and to be uncomfortable and like own it and deal with it instead of pushing it away. And so I think when we talk about being in leadership positions, sometimes we have to admit that we are part of the problem and figure out how to fix it. And so that is my, I guess, call to action piece of this land acknowledgement would be to say that if you occupy a position of privilege, you're going to be part of certain problems some of the time, and figuring out what you do with that is an important struggle, and it's one that's worthwhile. With that in mind, I'm going to turn it over to Mark and Nick, who are going to be running our session today, to talk about governance at the USC. As a reminder to everyone, I am recording this. I'm going to throw a link in the chat very shortly and ask you just to sign in so that I can make sure that you get access to links and recordings and that kind of thing.
Awesome. Thanks, Melissa. So we'll jump into who we are and kind of where me and Nick land on the side. I'm hoping this can be more of a discussion with everybody, just because governance can be easy to explain for people that know what it is, but better to explain to people that are asking questions. So I'll just premise that if you have any questions along the way, if you were curious about like maybe where, if you had one idea, where would it land in the council, board, jurisdiction, please don't hesitate to ask those questions. So I'll introduce myself. I'm Mark. I'm the VP Gov Finance for the USC. So I deal a lot with the policy manual, with council. I also sit on board and obviously executive council as well as an executive. So I'll pass over to Nick to introduce himself.
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Nick Sovay. I'm the Senior Manager, Advocacy and Government Services at the University Students' Council. So in my day job, I work with the student executive, student staff, and full-time staff at the USC to support our corporate governance, which occurs at council and board, and we'll get into that more throughout this session, as well as support the advocacy functions of the executive. So I've been here for a number of years now and love working here, and I've had lots of experience, to Jeremy's point, about working in a governance system that from the outside appears like it works great, but with every good organization, there's always the odd quirk here and there. So we are just the same. But yeah, happy to take any questions you have throughout the session as well.
Awesome.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
Here, go ahead, Nick. Or I'll go. We have too much of a formal process on this one. So the series is kind of just detailing out how to run for a position within USC. If you're curious about maybe how we're structured, or even just on the side of a student, you want to know maybe more about how the USC is there to support you. That's kind of where this series is headed. A lot of the time, we came from a couple of like building up your campaign team to how to build a platform, and now we're getting to the actual core governance of USC and what kind of makes us tick on the inside. So this session will be more geared towards that, and then I know we're finally getting to the last couple sessions of this series. It's more to be informative and to help everybody along the way through running a campaign or building up your own platform. So if there's any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. I think I've said this in every single student meeting I've had this year is shoot me an email, ask me a question. We're there to answer those questions. That's what our jobs are for. So don't hesitate to ask questions. So go ahead, Nick.
Sure. And I was just going to mention, Melissa, the last one of these is tomorrow morning, I'm pretty sure. And they will all be, as Mark, I think, alluded to or said, they will all be posted on our YouTube as well for anyone who needs to see them. Okay, so a number of years ago, the University Students' Council went through an exercise to create a strategic plan, and that was about 5 years ago now, I think. And during that process, we added to what was an existing mission statement. So our mission statement has been largely the same for a very, very long time. So to enhance the educational, and at the time it was just educational experience for all undergraduates at Western University. During the last strategic planning session, we added in that quality of life piece to better represent the reality of what we do. And then during that session as well, we decided to surround our mission statement with a vision statement and some value statements as well. So the vision statement is our aspirational statement that can be used a whole bunch of ways. Obviously, it's going to be a great marketing statement. It's also going to be a great reason for our staff, student staff, full-time staff, to come to work every day around a unified goal. So the University Students' Council vision statement is students have the power to change the world. So we try to live out that vision statement every single day by putting students into positions of power to make change. As I said, mission statement to enhance the educational experience and quality of life for all undergraduates at Western University. And finally, we have a set of core values that we try to live every day to ensure that we're following our mission and vision. Those are, we are democratic, inclusive, student-led, accountable, and we operate with integrity. As I said, all these came from that strategic planning process, which was quite a large engagement process in itself, where we did take feedback from students using surveys, as well as a number of focus groups to land at these values, mission, and vision statements. So, any questions about those? Okay. Then, so the governance structure at the USC can be perceived by looking at these 5 groups. The two probably most forward facing would be the Executive Council and the Council themselves. So each one of these groups has its own specific mandate, set of authority and responsibilities, and unique membership. And we're gonna spend most of the presentation, looking at these 5 groups. So we will go through, as I said, authority, responsibility. We'll go through a mock agenda of each one of these groups to show you what happens at a meeting. We've tried to pick meetings that were maybe a little more exciting than others, because sometimes the meetings can be boring. So we tried to make sure that they have a good range on those agendas. And I think that's all we'll do with just the governance structure and the groups that are part of our governance structure. So those are the 5, and there's a bit of a visual representation of how that works in practice. So Mark will be the first one, and I tend to agree with him. This is not perfect, but as I was joking with some of the folks on the start of the call, our system at times can be confusing, and this is the best current visual representation we have of what it looks like. So As you can see, starting at the very top, we have Western University students. They are essentially represented by their University Students' Council, which is a group of representatives that come together from every faculty and affiliate council, including the USC executive, to make decisions on behalf of the student body, tending to focus on the advocacy mandate of the organization. Within that, you have the executive of council, so that's your president, CEO, and other members of the executive. Then off to the side there, supporting both the board and the executive, are the staff of the USC. We will go in a bit more depth as to who those, maybe not who those people are, but those departments are and the functions they provide later on in the presentation. And then as well as the board of directors. So as you can see, the diagram is showing that there's a lot of back and forth that occurs between these groups, with the majority of the activity surrounding the council itself. Any questions so far? No? Executive Council.
Yeah, all premises is, I think we've talked about this in previous USC 101 type presentations, but I think it's good to note on the Executive Council, and we'll go into discussion about there's a bit of a scope for the Executive Council that isn't talked about a lot. It's more used for kind of strategic thinking, kind of setting the mandate for how the president is going about his role as both president and CEO of the organization. So that's a lot of what the executive kind of brings to the table. The VPs you'll find within the Executive Council do a lot of the portfolio specific work, so the file specific work. Obviously Vic's on the call as well, so she can speak to some of that side of things. And obviously I deal a lot with the policy manual and that gist, but Matt himself as the president is dealing with the actual strategic direction of the organization and managing that that side of things. So that's where the Executive Council plays into everything. It kind of leads into how we interact with both our group with council and the board of directors. And that's kind of like the two main groups that you'll see that the executive will interact with. And then obviously I deal with clubs as well. So I am part of that kind of area of the board. So if you want to go to the next slide, Nick. I believe we've touched on the kind of the reevaluation or how our compositions happened in the past year. But for the council, for the composition of our executive, this is kind of the breakout into the 5 different VPs and the president. So that's their 6-team executive. And then the executive council also includes the chief operating officer, Jeff, who is the head of the staff piece, is also responsible to the board. And then you have the senior managers as needed. So Nick's a great example. If Nick was, we were talking about something advocacy related, we bring Nick into the conversation to help advise some of the VPs on that level. And it's more of a formalized conversation with the executive. So it's kind of, executive council is a fun one. If we were just hanging out in the boardroom, sometimes we just, we're like, oh, we can be exec council as long as we write minutes for it. So that's the, that's kind of the gist of how exec council works, just to give something a bit more formalized governance structure wise. And then you have the executive assistant, Jacqueline, who usually just takes minutes there. So the only thing I'll highlight on this one is this is the new composition. Vic's explained this many more times than I have, but the VP from the past years have split into VP external and VP university, which you'll see in this structure itself now. So next, if you want to jump to the next one. So this is kind of the more jurisdiction of executive council. So it's the kind of the mandate and what's defined in the policy. So the terms of reference for the executive council, like I had said, it's about advising the president on certain matters and affairs. A lot of it is a lot of cross-portfolio collaboration. So if I was doing something with clubs, Hannah's doing something with her programming executives, we can talk about maybe what, especially in a COVID year, what our restrictions are, how we're going about that. And that's something that can be reported at executive council. And then there's also a consultation for the budgeting system. Obviously, the executives play a large role in that with their management on day-to-day, and then just talking with the staff piece. Jeff kind of delegates his tasks throughout. So that's kind of where, if we were to task Jeff with something, it's similar to where the board of directors would task him with something to do. We could task Jeff and the staff with doing something, and it would come out there at these meetings. So you'll find a lot of it's more about how we can drive the organization forward on certain files, rather than debating a number of topics. It's more just trying to align ourselves as an executive. And that's where the jurisdictions align themselves to council. Is there any questions about executive council at all? It's more just conversation and collaboration in a lot of ways. Okay. Awesome. Do you want to skip the next one? So this is a bit of a mock agenda. Usually we don't have too formal of agendas for this just because of the way that executive council is structured. We work as a team very often. So this is a great example. So you can see on this one, it has a standing item of advocacy strategy, council strategy within my position from Declan last year, Purple Fest, obviously in Bardia, and then you'll see student choice communications, orientation check-in with Cecilia, and that's kind of just like looping everybody into the discussion. A lot of the time it isn't for action items, it's just to make sure that we're all on the same page, and that's recorded into minutes. So that's where the jurisdiction aligns on this one. It's more just a collaboration. I think that you'll find a lot of us run in different directions as VPs. So being able to come back and have a conversation with Matt and make sure we're all on the same page, because there could be a different admin in a different position now that we wouldn't have all known about, but maybe Victoria knows about it now. So that's something you can talk about at these meetings. Is there any questions on like what it is? Yeah, go ahead, Jeremy.
Yeah, and I know this is because there's a little subtle nuance difference because you guys are obviously on the day-to-day on the ground stuff, but like how frequently does the executive itself like meet for this? Is this a once a day, once a week? How often does this kind of council get together?
Right now, I believe we're doing monthlies with exec councils, but like we also meet 3 times a week as an executive. So it's like we're trying to formalize like a monthly meeting, but if you wanted to, let's say this Friday, I wanted to call an exec council meeting, we could do it very easily because we already have the spots and things. And just like I said, we went on a retreat and I think we recorded the minutes for the meeting, and I was like, that's an exec council meeting right there. So that's kind of where we function. But
that makes sense.
Maybe Jeremy, can I try restating the question? Because I think I know what you're asking and it may get a slightly different answer out of Mark. So Mark, how would your team decide between this is a conversation that we're having in a meeting, it's free flowing, compared to this is executive council, this is something that needs to go in front of this more formal group? What's the decision-making process there that decide what goes to the 3 times a week meeting and what goes to the once in a month meeting?
Yeah, that's a good way of framing the question because that's easier to answer. I would say what we try to do in these meetings is to put stuff in stone for the future executive. So I would say when we call these meetings as executive council to put things in minutes, it's more for the councils in 3 years that are going to look back on this year and say, oh, Mark went and made a change to the orientation budget because of this direction. And that's why we have these conversations written down. And that's like, so like the call would be like, I'll keep using orientation as, let's say we wanted to move orientation week, not the first week, but the second week. And the executive would talk about that internally, but then we want to write it down somewhere so they knew what our track record was of making that decision. And that's where this kind of comes from. Yeah.
And then another piece I'll add on top of that is that as well, decision makers and this is putting my advocacy hat on for a second, decision makers tend to respond really great when they can see a piece of paper that has been passed by a group of people that essentially says, thou shalt do this, tends to show that there's backing to an idea. So that's another way we sometimes will use this group as well.
Yeah.
But that tends to be something that is done more by council.
Awesome. Any other questions on the exec council end? It's more just formalizing conversations, really. That's the big purpose of it. But it's very useful for, like, I can go back right now and look 2 years back and see what the exec decided on Purple Fest, right? And it's put in stone. So it's a good thing to have.
So yes, if you have joined recently and haven't had a chance to fill out the sign-in form that Melissa has put in the chat, please do so. That helps us make sure we can get the information. If there's any supplemental, that we can get it out to you and send the rest of the recordings from the rest of the series to you as well. Okay, anything else on this one, or can we move to board?
We're good for board.
Okay.
Board.
So the University Students' Council is a incorporated, what would be considered by modern day standards, a not-for-profit corporation. When we incorporated back in the 50s, that designation did not exist, so we had to incorporate provincially under the Corporations Act. So we are incorporated provincially. So as the organization is governed by the Act provincially, and that is supposed to change in theoretically the next year. The legislation has been sitting in front of the government awaiting royal assent and enforcement for the better part of the last decade. So who knows, could be this year, could be next year, could be the year after, who knows. But we are compliant with both versions of the Act, which is very important. But The reason I'm bringing this up is that we do exist within a larger legal framework that is mandated by the provincial government. So that provides us with a very clear set of guidelines that we need to follow as an organization by the Act to ensure that we are meeting our needs as a corporation from a legal point of view. And typically the role of the board is to ensure that compliance with the Act, ensure that we're not making any sort of legal missteps or undue financial risk. So a lot of that work is done by the board of directors. So what we're looking at with the board of directors is it's a group of, and I always get this number mixed up with another, it's 9 students, with one of them being voting members, with one of them being the USC president. The rest are students at large who are hired. I'm pretty sure that posting will be coming up shortly. So if any of you are interested in this call on the board of directors, Mark is a fantastic, or myself, but definitely check out Mark first. Fantastic resource to understand the board of directors and how to get involved with that group. But what we'll go through right now is the committee structure. So the board itself does meet approximately once per month each month of the school year, and then at least once over the summer. This year with the pandemic, we were meeting, I don't know what, Mark, every like 2 or 3 weeks. It was very frequent. We were meeting way more than we've ever met for the board of directors. But if we're doing an hour's worth of board work, let's say, all these committees have probably gone through 1 to 2 hours each of work to get us to that board meeting. Really the engine of our board of directors are these committees. And what you'll see here is that we have kind of divided the organization, and that risk management portion of it, which is the main objective of board of directors, is to control risk and make sure the corporation can endure kind of the test of time, into these groups. So what we've done is we've divided it into our finance committee, our appeals board, Gazette publications committee, governance, and human resources. And I am just going to sneak ahead just to make sure that we don't describe those in the next one. No, okay, good. So I'll go through the authority of each of those committees on this slide, and then we'll go maybe just a bit more global about the board on the next one. But finance committee tends to be the committee that has, I would say, the clearest mandate of our board committees. Tends to focus dollars and cents, budgets, projections, making sure our investments are being managed by the appropriate people. That tends to be the work of the finance committee. So they get their monthly financial statements to get that snapshot at how the organization is doing. I'm going to go in a different order than it's listed. So I'm going to go to appeals board, human resources, and then go to the other two. The other two tend to be a bit more unique and kind of outliers in our system. So the governance committee deals with our bylaws, policies, and procedures that govern the organization. This group, some people say they don't like talking about process. This group only talks about process and how we ensure the process we are following is fair and equitable for all members of our board, to ensure that we are managing that risk. So this is the framework, the set of rules that the organization operates within is primarily done by the governance committee. So if you're not excited to read thousands of lines of text and provide comments about amendments, or if the bylaws or policies are still reasonable, that is not the committee for you, because that is the vast majority of the work this committee does. The Human Resources Committee, our board of directors is obviously unique. There's very few boards in the world that are going to take a group of people in their early 20s and say, hey, here's this multi-million-dollar organization, go do your thing. As a result of that decision, which is going back to our mission, vision, values, putting the students in that leadership position, so it's very important for us to do that. But to ensure that they all feel supported and can succeed in their role, the Human Resources Committee kind of has two functions, deals with the rules around how we're ensuring our compliance with labor laws, that's one thing. But another big part of this group is the development of the board of directors themselves. So ensuring that our directors are the best possible people they can be to provide value to the organization through their role as a director. Those are the two roles of the Human Resources Committee. And then the two outliers, like I said, Appeals Board and Gazette Publications Committee. So most people, the average student isn't aware that the University Students' Council is actually the publisher of the Gazette. What that means is that we are the one that provides, predominantly what a publisher does is it provides the financial support to actually operate a newspaper. In our case, that's not entirely the case because the Gazette does have its own fee. But what we do is we provide kind of that legal, HR, finance backbone to the organization so the Gazette can do the work it needs to do to report on happenings on campus in the London community. So the publications committee receives reports from the front office, is managing the recruitment process for the front office, and deals with kind of the big organizational shifts that the Gazette needs to go through. Appeals board is the final one I'll talk about, and we actually have a whole section on that. So probably what I'll just mention here is that it does sit as a committee of the board, but is an extremely unique committee that does require its kind of its own section. So really long description on committees, but it's because they are the main driver of the board's activity. So any questions about what I discussed so far? And if you don't want to speak your question, if you put it into the chat, it'll take me a second, but I will be able to pull that question up as well. For now, I'll move forward. So authority. So as I said, as per the Act, our board of directors is most focused on the following things. So our human resources, labor management, audit, banking, our financial controls, essentially to ensure that we're not spending in inappropriate ways or that there's not the right check and balance to the people spending money. Legal, ranging from contracts with service providers to leases for the folks in the UCC. Yeah, and all of this is outlined in our bylaw 1. So if you hadn't had a chance to look at bylaw 1 and you're thinking of running for one of the executive roles, I know it seems like very odd reading, but it is very important because it clearly defines the responsibilities and roles of the various groups. So all this content comes from that bylaw 1, which Mark will go over and I later in the presentation. Any questions on the, Where can students access the document? Haley, are you looking for a link or do you just want me to say it?
I think this is just like an overarching question because even with like bylaw 2, it's just so hard to find it. Like if you look up like bylaw 1, bylaw 2, like the first things that come up are like, it literally says last amended in like 2014. So if thanks Mark. If like the USC could do like a better job at like making sure like the search results for
optimization
are like up to date, like that'd be great.
Cool. Sometimes it's harder to do that than it sounds, but I do know where you're coming from and totally agree with you. Google makes it purposefully difficult for a reason, but yeah, very, very fair point. That link will get you to it, but the point's well taken, Haley. So it is on our website. I'm pretty sure, I feel like this is something that we may need to look at and then maybe put into the, sorry, Melissa, it looks like you got an answer to that.
So yeah, I'm just.
It's under, so if you go to the voice section, it's under documents on the tab. And it's listed, you'll see documents like policy manual, and then it goes to documents, and then it'll say like the budgets as well. But I do agree that it should be more accessible because I had a hard time when I got this job finding it. So I will preface that as well.
There we go. Yeah. So under the Your Voice section, documents. Any other questions? Cool. So sample agenda. So what you'll notice here is this template doesn't change too much from meeting to meeting. So at every meeting, we're going to go through the first 5 items. Most of those items are outlined in the Act as requirements, except for comments from the chair, but everything else there is a requirement of the Act itself. So those tend to be procedural and happen very, very quickly as to ensure that we have records of our meetings. That's the minutes section. The agenda, just the order of what we're going to talk about. Conflict of interest, that's something that every organization should take extremely seriously. Ensuring that we're not making decisions with a bias is essentially what that means. But the 3 sections that I really want to go into are reports and presentations for information. You'll notice on here that there's the USC Executive Report and Operations Report. Those are delivered at every board meeting by the USC President as well as the COO. So each report's going to focus on slightly different items, but all of them are going to be of board jurisdiction. So obviously the USC president will also provide a report to the council, and different content goes to different groups depending on the jurisdiction as outlined in the bylaw. Then, and you can see from our agenda how much we prioritize committees. So this is a good visual representation of what I meant from earlier about how those committees really do act as the engine of the board. So if you're sitting on one of the committees, that's where you're going to spend the majority of your time, and you're going to be seen as an expert on that topic. So let's say you sit on the governance committee, first listed here, and let's say you're working on our risk identification policy or the associate and coordinator policy. You're reviewing that policy to make sure the framework is accurate. And then you recommend any sort of changes or action from that committee to the board for ratification. So essentially what happens is the experts say, we've reviewed this, we think X, Y, and Z should happen. Hey, board of directors, this is our recommendation. And then the whole board debates it, but on the recommendation though of those experts. So it helps show that there's that check before it gets to the larger group, that someone's gone in depth to make sure they've really looked at the implications of those decisions. And we do that with all of our committees. The only exception is the appeals board is only required to report it's either twice or yearly to the board, typically after their work is done in the spring term. So any questions about the board of directors? This is our last slide on this part of our governance structure.
Go ahead, Jeremy.
Have at it.
Yeah, no, sorry, just, and you might have gone over this, but you talked about how often the board meets. Is there a standard expectation of how often these subcommittees of the board meet? Or is it does it vary? And I'm thinking more so of the ones like the governance, finance, human resources, like, is it also, so you said like it's once a month, would the committees also meet once a month?
So I would say it all depends on the topics being discussed by the board of directors. Our rule that we try to follow as best as we possibly can is that no item ends up on one of these agendas unless it's gone through a committee first. The obvious exception to that is an emerging issue that would go into new business because we're having to pull a crisis or an emergency meeting together. That would obviously not go through a committee. Everything else needs to hit a committee first is our objective. As a result, there are many times where specifically, actually all committees may meet up to 2, 3, 4 times a month before they get to board. Really, the average is 1 or 2 though, to get that information reviewed so it does have that expert's opinion when it goes to the board. Governance this year has been meeting, I'd say on average twice a month. I think human resources has had to have a couple of double meetings as well. Finance has some peaks and valleys in their legislative cycle. In September, the audit is wrapping up, but it's a busy part of the year for them. So they may either have a really long meeting or 2 meetings. Same with as budget goes through in January and February, they're very busy then as well, and they'd have 2 or 3 meetings a month at that point. So there's no hard and fast rule, but that's generally how we proceed.
The other thing I'll add on is we also have agenda committee as well before each meeting, which like the board chair also sits on. So if there's something that needs to be added there, it usually happens at like agenda if it's not committee wise, or he'll throw it back to committee if he needs to.
And to go a bit more in depth as to what an agenda committee does, because that's a great catch, Mark. They're responsible for essentially creating this document in front of you. And it seems like a pretty small thing, but we take it really seriously because we want to make sure, one, we have enough time to have the decisions we need to have. So that's why you see the timing on the right side of the agenda, as well as identify if we need external experts to come in. So let's say there's something that's really sticky situation that our lawyer needs to be there. We will actually invite the USC lawyer to present to the board, or whoever it may be, right? A senior manager comes in to discuss one of the areas that they wouldn't normally talk about. Because myself as senior manager advocacy and government services, Vicky McCauley, who's responsible for finance, Carla Pacheco, who's responsible for people development, and Jeff Armour are the 4 staff resources that come to every board meeting. But other senior managers will come if they have something in their area that we're talking about. So the board gets a lot of support to make sure they have the right information to make a good decision. Any other questions? Sorry. Okay. No? Okay. We'll move on to council.
Awesome. Yeah, so council is more under my domain than I'd say the staff side. So and obviously Melissa helps support a lot of it. So council is kind of the democratically elected arm of the USC. You'll see, obviously it's probably more the forward-facing jurisdiction of the USC. So it's made up of 49 student representatives. Actually, that's going to change for next year, but it will be now a higher number, which just got voted on last night. So it's kind of like the almost like the consultation body in a way for the USC. A lot of the work they do goes towards how we direct our initiatives, how we direct our advocacy a lot of the time, because they're that student voice. So it brings that student directive and it helps the organization be driven in the right way, so they're not getting too corporate and bringing back down to the earth of the students. So the one thing I would say about this group is it's kind of like the what's mainly impacting students and like what are the motions bringing forward. You'll see within the actual agenda, a lot of it is more of the groundwork of like what the VP UA is doing for some certain advocacy within, they'd say, Proctor Track. Like that's kind of the conversation that happens there, whereas the board would never get involved in that conversation, just because they oversee the organizational side of things. So it's interesting. As a student union, we have a board and a council. It's not very common, but the council is able to do a lot more specific work because we're able to separate it out, and they have a bit more of a directive in that way, and that's the reason why we do it. So, Nick, you want to jump to the next one? So there's kind of similar to the board setup. We have 4 different committees. The names are different now. As well. So this is some of my own work that is my own fault. So on that end, but so there's the 4 different committees. So governance and finance, which is my committee that I kind of support directly, which deals a lot with the internal policy. So anything policy-wise, I think we had about 5 policies come forward yesterday from GNF, and that's stuff that anything internally that needs to be vetted or reviewed over time, will go to that committee, and then it'll go to council itself. This one is a little bit less common for having the committees vet things right away than the board is. Board is very structured in that the committees do a lot of the work for it, whereas council is more of a check and balance in a way for the committees to make sure that the experts are seeing it beforehand, but it's not as common. The second one is the external advocacy committee. So Mackenzie, in her role as external VP, supports that committee, and a lot of it is around USA and UCRU and how we engage externally with municipal, federal, and provincial advocacy. And then the student experience one is now university affairs as of last night. So that is the committee structure is more around how we engage, let's say orientation wise or Vic student work on some sort of academic wise. The advocacy kind of goes there, and any conversation usually happens at those committees. And then the last one is agenda and council operations, which is similar to the board as well. They meet a week prior to and make sure the agenda's set up in place. So the committees aren't, I would say, as important as board, but they do create a check and balance in a lot of ways, and it does divide out a lot of the work that council would usually see because it is so large. So that's the standing committee piece. Let's want to move on to the next one, Nick. So council's jurisdiction is a lot of the work, let's say groundwork that's being done. So I'll give a couple of examples of maybe working groups that were created this year that council's involved with and recommendations they'll make. So we just had a tuition policy paper passed through council, which helped drive our tuition advocacy moving forward. We also had a sustainability working group created, a gender-based violence working group created. So it's stuff like that usually comes through council, and it's the advocacy piece of it. You'll see through the 2 working groups, but also discussions around student interests. So elections, big deal within the USC. A lot of that goes through council itself. So bylaw 2 is the jurisdiction of council, and that's the kind of where the elected students are able to voice their opinions on certain matters. So all of it is set out in bylaw 1, as we had premised about the board, but it gives us an ability to connect back to students. And the executive is kind of the executive council of council, and then we also work for council directly as they are our boss in a lot of sense because we're either elected or hired by council. So, Nick, if you want to go to probably describes it better in the agenda. Student interest is a broad term to use. Yeah, so like an example council agenda, you'll see the committees are divided out as well. We also do executive reports, which are now for action items. So some good examples here. This is from a last year's example. So you'll see in the advocacy standing committee, which is more external now, a lot of just more advocacy paper based. If there's anything being passed, menstrual products on campus will go through university affairs committee. That's stuff that will all get worked on through the council itself. And then you'll see all the bylaw changes, executive council, standing orders, that'll all go through GNF. And then more for information reports will all come from the board. The board of directors is responsible to council as well. So that's kind of a fun one where the board operates independently, but they are responsible to council. So that's because they're elected by council. And so the council is kind of our core legitimate group, and because it's a student representative body. And that's, if you go into our bylaw 1, counselors are our membership, and that's like the corporation membership is council. If you go back into that world of the nonprofit act. So, Nick, is there anything you want to add on this end at all?
I will make one note that to just make it explicit, because I think you alluded to it. The interesting thing is, so Mark at the very beginning of his description of council said it's unique that we would have both. And that is very, very, very true. There's very few organizations in Canada that operate like the USC does, having both those groups as their kind of main decision-making body. Most would just have one, so we have both. That is a function actually that the council a number of years ago made a decision, to essentially make a board of directors. So when Mark says that they are responsible for, they are actually a creature of, which therefore means at any moment the council can just be like, no, this is not what we want the board to be doing, which is obviously an interesting dynamic to have and something that would identify a pretty massive constitutional crisis within our system if that were to ever occur. That'd be a big, big problem. But it is the reality of the situation that the board was created by the council with a specific mandate of what they were supposed to do on behalf of the council.
Yeah, I would say that's a great point, Nick. It's the democratically elected piece of this is big for council. Everything that's done in the USC has been delegated through council at some point, staff-wise, executive-wise, clubs governance-wise. That's all from council originally. So they're the core group that decides on what happens to the USC. So, and not many people know that. When they walk in, they see 30 different groups, but that's the main core legitimate group. So, awesome. Is there any questions around council at all? I know it's this council is a different body now than a lot of other groups, but it's kind of like our core legitimate, democratically elected. Go ahead, Jeremy.
Yeah, at least I have a number of questions, but I think Mark, you and I could connect offline to really dig into this. But the one that just stood out off the hop that I'm wondering might be useful is the 49 counselors. Is there a particular? This is more of a technical side question, but like how you arrived at that number in terms of like student representation? Like, is that representative of like size of faculties, departments, that type of thing, or I'm curious about the technical side of that.
Yeah, you hurt me on this one.
Okay.
we talked about it last night at council. That's fine. So it was a per constituent basis. So the policy, that's council composition policy in our policy manual. So it reads that every faculty and professional school that we represent and its affiliates as well, get one seat on council, and then per 1,000 students, you get an additional seat per 1,000. But council last night decided that all the faculties under the 1,000 will now get 2 counselors. So the president but everybody above 1,000 will not get the 2 counselors as a base. So that's kind of like what happened last night. But it usually is per population composition. So if, let's say, arts and humanities had 1 counselor because they were under 1,000, now they would have 2. But let's say social sci had 7, they would still be 7. So that's kind of like where we're at right now at the current moment.
Other questions about council? Or just generally anything we've talked about so far?
I have a question about the composition. Wouldn't that mean that it's like not proportional?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So
it was council's decision to move forward with the composition, so I yield to council.
Okay. That's it. That was my only question.
Yeah. Any other questions? Melissa has put into the chat the council composition procedure. Okay.
It's updated the changes from last night. So.
Start again, because your microphone didn't pick you up.
Thanks. I just said it's been updated already to show what the changes from last night. So all the numbers are based on last night's changes.
So the version that Melissa just in case that didn't come through clearly for everyone, the version that Melissa has shared in the chat is the most up-to-date, reflecting the change that was made last night by council. Okay, Mark, do we want to move on?
Yeah, we're good.
Okay, so I said that this committee, the board, needed its own section. That's because at times it kind of acts as a separate check and balance to the actions of the organization. So the Board of Appeals, it is a backstop for two other decision-making bodies within the University Students' Council. So someone believes that a policy or bylaw has been incorrectly applied by specifically two groups, the Club's Governance Committee or the Elections Governance Committee. That student has the right to go to the Board of Appeals with an appeal. So what the group will, actually, I just want to make sure something first. So the authority of this group is, like I said, any decisions, CGC and elections. And essentially what they do is they will review the process that those two committees followed to come to their decision and ensure that it followed the proper process. And if it didn't, they have a host of options at their disposal on, as to what they do about that. The appeals board is made up of, oh boy, we changed it recently and I'm always confused as to what 7 individuals with 6 members at large. I'm pretty sure what it is, but 7 or 9, I can't remember exactly. We made a change last year and I'm still stuck between the two. But the students at the end of the day sitting on this appeals board are hired at large from the student population. They apply to an application process. The chair of the appeals board, which is required to be a former just ordinary member, because everyone sits as 2-year terms on the appeals board, is the one who leads the appeals board and is the one that conducts the hiring to select the rest of the appeals board. And their job is to essentially run the appeals board to ensure it is effectively managed and has the ability to make the decisions that it's outlined to do in the bylaw. So like I said, check and balance. And this group really is only active in the spring term after club ratifications and elections. So it has a very short amount of time, sometimes to do an excessive amount of work. I think some years they've had 20+ appeals to get done in about a month and a half, which when you think about how long each appeal takes, that is an excessive amount of work. So they do work very hard for what they have to do to support all the students, but it is an important group on campus. So any questions on this one before we go to clubs governance?
Awesome. So I will take over clubs as my child. So clubs governance board is the board delegated by council to decide on most things policy wise, and you'll see ratification wise as well for within the club system. So they make all the decisions as a elected group of students that are elected by council. So a lot of the time you'll see them evaluate risk, handle most of the club governance policies. So if you wanted to create a new club and you saw a club constitution outline, that's something that the club's governance board would deal with. And that's kind of like where they decide on that end. So a lot of it is within my portfolio because I own the club's policy coordinator who sits as chair and the associate clubs, but the elected representatives are the ones that have voting rights on the committee. So that's the jurisdiction of them a little bit. Most of it's around just the operations and compliance with clubs. And they also, let's say a club stepped out of bounds on the club policy, they would also sanction them further. So yeah, good example, they act as a mini council in a way. But I think the sanctioning piece is probably the one that comes out more often than not. So right now, if a club ran an in-person event with 30 people, that's something that would probably go to them because we've created rules around not having in-person events over 10 people right now, just based on provincial guidelines. So that's kind of where their work heads. They usually deal a lot with like more things that, like, if the associate clubs doesn't want to deal directly with them, or if my club's policy wants to recommend it to the CGB decide on, they're the governing committee from council that will decide on that for us. So I'm trying to think of a draft agenda. I'm just thinking of something that would go on there would be any policy changes from the club's policy review panel or committee, which is also run by my club's policy coordinator would all go through them. Anything ratification-wise, de-ratification. We reset the rules this year, so that was passed by them as well. They're kind of just like the check and balance in the work we do in clubs. So. Is there any questions about clubs at all? It's I'll just, mini council is a great way to reference it. So. Cool.
Okay. So staff, I did mention them at the very beginning. What we're going to go through now is just a basic description of some of our departments. If you attended some of the earlier sessions, you would have got a bit more information around this as well. So that is Jeff Armour. He is the Chief Operating Officer at the University Students' Council. The way I like to describe him, and he gets a good laugh out of it every time I say it, is he is the board of directors, essentially their only resource. They can essentially delegate work to Jeff, and it is his responsibility to execute on that work. Jeff is also the leader of what would be considered the bureaucracy of the University Students' Council. So it's all the staff who, Melissa and myself are great examples, who are here year over year. So while people like Mark and Haley, who are in student roles, may change from year to year, we are here, this is our full-time job. We bring a professional expertise to the role that the students can tap into to be successful in their job. So if Mark has a question about governance and he hasn't seen that situation occur yet in his year, he may turn to Melissa or myself and say, hey, like, what do I do in this scenario? And then we're expected to have best practice from either our experience, our education, to provide Mark with the insight he needs to be successful in his job. So Jeff leads that group of people. And the organization a number of years ago was quite large, and we're going through definitely a pivot right now where we're refocusing the organization to make sure our staff are in the areas where we are doing the most amount of work. So we used to have a staff population of upwards of 60. We're now closer to 40 as we start to rebuild and focus in on areas of student priority to make sure that we're still relevant with students of today. And that's been Jeff's main focus since he got in the job a number of years ago. So Jeff is the leader of our bureaucracy. So here are generally the departments. Some of these have been combined and separated depending on what they do. So there's a senior manager who is, like myself, who is responsible for each of these white boxes. For example, I'm responsible for advocacy and government services. Nick Vasiliou is responsible for USC promotions, and the list goes on and on and on. So if there is something you see on this slide and you're like, I really want to know who does that, please ask and I will mention it, but I'm not going to go through and mention every single one. But generally what the bureaucracy focuses on is executing the vision of Students' Council, the board of directors, and the executive to make sure that that vision becomes a reality. So advocacy services supports our student advocates, be it the executives or counselors, in trying to see change in areas where they have concerns. We try to do this most notably through our advocacy work by using policy and knowledge-based advocacy. So Melissa and I are the staff supports there. USC Promotions promotes the USC events and initiatives, providing marketing material to kind of get the word out there as to what we do. Government services is what makes the council and board essentially operate within a set of rules. So we provide best practice advice on how to structure the governance of the organization. Information systems. This is the department that's responsible for our IT backbone that the USC operates on, making sure we have things from computers to a server where things can live. Very small but mighty team, I will add. Jeff Pimlat does a fantastic job with only him and one other person. People in development, never mind. I will mention everyone by name. I said I wouldn't, but I might as well. People in development, Carla, she is a fantastic resource that ensures that we follow the essentially labor laws, and also a big focus, and where Carla really shines, is ensuring student development. So that's providing students with the opportunity to grow in their student leadership roles. So providing PD sessions or access to the USC Alumni Network. It's a really cool part of the organization that ensures we have really awesome people who continue to grow while they're with us, which is really, really important and goes back to kind of our mission, vision, values. Hospitality and productions, this would be the folks who run the Spoke and the Wave, as well as put on all those fantastic events that students will attend. They ensure all those run extremely well. That area is led by Mark Leonard, fantastic colleague, huge Raptors fan. If you ever get a chance to speak with him, make sure you mention that on top of his work responsibilities. Financial services, so this is under many names, but essentially it's the finance and accounting department led by Vicky McCauley. This provides support to the finance committee as well as just day-to-day accounting, which may seem like an insignificant amount of work, but it is a lot. Isn't that right, Mark?
Yep.
A lot. So Vicky leads a really great team there. Student event services, so this is the group, this is kind of split half between our clubs folks as well as kind of the productions team, but this makes sure that all the club events and events we run are run smoothly and without too much undue liability to make our insurance people happy. So that's, I think that's, yeah. So that's generally the departments. Any questions about those before we go on to CIA? No?
Awesome. Yeah, so I'll just touch on the last piece of this. We have two of our associates on the call anyway, so they can talk about their own experience if they'd like. But CIA is our it's coordinators, interns, and associates. Associate vice presidents, sorry. Just calling it associates. So the coordinators and associate vice presidents fall under the executive, and the interns fall under the staff piece. So the interns support some of the staff work, and a lot of the time it's more research based, or if they're the CRO, DRO, speaker of council, will fall under interns. And then you have your associates and coordinators, which each executive has, except for Matt, obviously, as president. So I can give an example. I have an associate vice president clubs, but I also have 3 coordinators that fall under that associate that deal directly with club system. They're kind of just a great support for us as executives because we obviously have a number of files juggling all the time, and it was something that was needed in the past. So they also fall under kind of a full-time staff, part-time staff piece, which we do a lot for students. So that's another side of it versus like the operational staff piece that we do hire students as well. So I don't have much else to add on the CI piece. It's pretty straightforward. So. Any questions on that, the staff structure at all before I jump into bylaws? Okay. Awesome. So we have 4 bylaws. Bylaw 4 is new. It's the finance bylaw. Thanks, Haley. The finance bylaw. So the 3 bylaws that have been pretty structured over time have been bylaw 1, 2, and 3, and then the 4 was just added recently last year by my predecessor. So the bylaw 1 is kind of the corporation bylaw. You'll find that aligns directly with all the acts, and that's where we've been referencing a lot of the jurisdiction of the organization. It's fairly well structured in how it divides out. We're reviewing it right now actually internally, and there's been a lot of conversation around it. It goes to legal. It's kind of like the main core bylaw of the organization. So I would say if you're gonna want to understand the organization, read that bylaw. That's probably your best bet. And then jumping into bylaw 2, Nick likes to reference it as the glove in the hand. So bylaw 2 is kind of the elections bylaw. So we go around how we want to plan for running for, like, say, USC president. You would read bylaw 2 to understand the rules and engagement with that. But then bylaw 1 is how the corporation is set up for when you get that role. So those are kind of the 2 main bylaws on that piece. And then bylaw 3 is the executive bylaw. This was introduced to kind of oversee the executives and understand our roles a bit better. So when the executive restructuring happened, a lot of that was in the context of the executive bylaw. So it's understanding how my role may work with Matt's role in the corporate piece, or maybe my role will work with Cam from a communication side, and that's kind of where the jurisdictions and the responsibilities are outlined. So that's where the bylaws are our framework for our institution. They're kind of like the roadmap, and then we get into policy, which is more the cars running around on the road. So that's the my spiel on my spiel on the bylaws themselves. And the last bylaw 4 is just how we monitor ourselves. It's mostly a bylaw for myself directly, just because it's how we spend money, how we get approvals. Obviously, student money is an important piece of all of this, and as an organization that charges fees, we needed to outline something that was in relation to our own bylaws. So this was a bylaw that was passed recently that kind of oversees how fees are collected, who oversees it, what the responsibility is, how fiduciary responsibility is decided, and it goes back to the board of directors as well. So, Nick, is there anything you want to add on the bylaws? I went through it fairly quickly, but.
Yeah, no, I think for anyone listening, the best way to think of the bylaws is everything that we just explained in this presentation has some sort of origin within these bylaws. So we've essentially turned what can be very verbose or unclear language into this presentation to try to explain how the USC is governed. Bylaws are almost intentionally not meant to be all that accessible, just by the way that the act is written is very confusing. Whereas what we've tried to do is provide more of a plain language explanation as to what the heck all these things mean. That doesn't mean that the bylaws aren't important for everyone to review, because you really should. If you're ever part of a board of directors or a member of an organization, you should be aware of what the bylaws are and how that governs what you are and are not allowed to do within the organization. They're very important documents. So that's the only thing I would add, Mark.
Yeah, and bylaw 2 was just recently updated as well at the last council meeting. So if there is, board is also starting to review it as well. So if there is questions, that's just been updated. Most of it's just like clarification, but that is a new document as well. So
Okay.
Awesome. Yeah, it's good for bylaws. Awesome. Trying to think of a good example for this. I was thinking of it as we were going through this.
Oh yeah.
Nick, do you have any good thoughts on?
Okay. I think a good one to start would be, there were lots of discussions at the beginning of the year around cost of education. I think that would be a great one. So let's say a student came to Mark and said, I'm worried about how expensive post-secondary education is, and I would like to do something about it. Where the exec council, board, or council do you think Mark would direct that student to essentially have their issue around cost of education be heard go, based off what you've heard today in the session?
Anybody can answer.
What was the question?
Cost of education.
Yeah, where would it go, Parker, cost of education wise? There's a couple answers for this. It doesn't have to be just one.
Yeah.
The cost of tuition for students?
Yeah. Yeah. So you could make the justification that it maybe would first go to the executive council if it was something that they felt they could work on with the university to try to get things lowered. Obviously, well, not obviously. Tuition is regulated by the provincial government. So what would probably make the most sense if we're trying to make system-wide change would be to send it to the council, as those are the student representatives that can maybe make an advocacy position out of it and say, like, let's write a paper on tuition, which I'm pretty sure passed unanimously or almost unanimously last night at council, our tuition policy paper, to create a stance that then the executive could go out and advocate on. What we hear a lot is people don't know where to take what issues to which committees. Essentially what it comes down to. So trying to make it easier by helping with like a bit of a process to make those decisions.
And the big thing, my role usually gets involved in that when it gets to what goes where, just from interpretation of policy. But so like even that question, that could go to me from a fee standpoint, right? And we can talk about it from fees, but I would say like, that's why we always have the executives like the forefront, and the issue identification comes from the executive, but it might go to council or it might go to board, depending on where the exec decides it sees fit, it fits. So
maybe another example for anyone, Mark, if you want to. So recently there was the extension of the winter break. So how the USC as an organization may handle that, what group do you think would talk about that?
Exec council.
Yeah.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah, and then it went to council for the legislative calendar, but that was after the exec council discussed on what impact it would make, like twofold wise. So, yeah. Nice.
Does anyone have any questions of things they wouldn't know where they would want to go and they would want to ask us, because we can provide you with our best guess? Because the other thing for all you to know is that when these come up, sometimes Mark and I are like, well, that's a doozy. Where the heck do we put that one?
Yeah.
I have like a slight in terms of like the dynamic because I feel because we've got some great staff members on hand in terms of that role of that. Nick, you talked about the kind of changing fluctuation of what the staff model kind of looks like. Does that sort of direction come from like mandate from council, the board, like when those types of adjustments are being made to like staffing of those sets? Like where does the actual kind of like either A, planning of that come from, or B, like the actual, you know, like hiring, that kind of stuff?
So any sort of hiring or more like HR, so hiring discipline, those types of things would all sit with the senior managers that are responsible for their departments. So that's what we're responsible for. In terms of staffing levels, that would be really a discussion probably at executive council that they would identify, they being the executive, that we're feeling like we need more support in this area. And then Jeff would take that back to a group called SMT, so the senior management team, which is myself and all the peers on all the other senior managers plus Jeff Armour, where he would say, okay, so the executive are looking for more blank. And we'd be like, okay, we could do this, 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 or this. And then we're normally tasked with then executing that. So we may absorb that within, so let's say I knew that Melissa had some extra capacity to take on a new file. I may say, hey, Melissa, can you take this on? She'll say, yeah, or no, I'm too busy. And then we may look at a student employee or full-time. We'll look at all the options possible. But that really is taking insight from the students. So maybe from exec council, board, or council, that then the bureaucracy has to respond to meet the needs of the students where they need us to be. Like, for example, the USC used to run a post office, I think, way back in the day. And like, there's things that we used to do. And like, we used to sell bus tickets. One of our biggest sources of revenue is bus tickets. With the student pass, that's not as necessary anymore, right? So things change and we just can't get left in the dust. That would obviously be very bad for us and for our students if we never followed the times. Yeah.
It's a weird one because our council, exec council used to be the board. And like, that's a pretty common thing in most situations. So we would have, but now the exec provides direction to the staff. The staff is technically accountable to COO, who's accountable to the board. So it's like we set the strategic direction a lot as exec, but then it's still under the board per se as the actual staff manager. Yeah.
Okay, wait. There. So it's just some key dates for anyone considering running. We have our, like I said, last session tomorrow starting at 10:30. Is that close, Melissa? Or did I just make a random time? I was right. Look at that. That's rare. Then, so these dates actually now are not correct. We haven't decided what we're doing with these dates now that the...
I've decided.
We haven't decided yet.
Oh, great. This is news to me too. What are we doing?
So everything's just getting pushed a week. So the nomination period is now the 12th to the 19th instead of the 5th to the 12th. The all candidates meeting will be on the 19th of January. The campaign period will then run from the 20th to the 2nd of February, I believe, with voting on the 1st and 2nd. Results will be on the 4th. I've typed this out a lot of times today and a lot of emails to different people.
Yes.
Got this one down.
So for anyone who's watching this after the fact, yes, everything has happened the last couple of days for that winter break to be extended. So we're having to respond fairly quickly to figure out what that looks like for the election timeline, because it does happen to impact that very perfectly right at the beginning of the process. So, but everything's being moved by a week, which sounds fantastic.
Does that mean that election season isn't, like the campaign period isn't a full 2 weeks before the 2 voting days? Or it's 2 weeks including those 2 voting days now?
It's 2 weeks including the days, right?
Yeah, it's the same length of time as it was before. It's literally we just moved everything by 1 week. So I just went down the calendar and bumped everything.
Yeah.
If you're looking, I can hold on. I will link our legislative calendar as well in the chat. Just give me 1 minute to pull it up.
There was a lot of changes last night. If you want, that's context for anybody watching.
While Melissa finds that, if you are considering running for president, vice president, Carla doesn't have the dates firmed up yet, but you should let her know that you would like to know them when they are firm, because there are a number of mandatory training sessions that if you are successful in securing these positions, or if you're considering board and council, there are also mandatory training sessions for all of those groups. It's just there's a lot more for the president and vice president. Specifically, the president needs to attend everything that I just listed, so board, council, and their own training. So there's a lot of dates you need to know that will range as far as into about a year from now. So please do reach out if you're considering running, so you know what those are, and you can put some holds in your calendar. You'd be surprised how quickly your summer books up. Any questions? Sorry, Melissa.
If you're running for council, the training dates, at least for March and April, are on that legislative calendar. So you have that link. That one's set.
Does anyone have any questions that we didn't get to?
I have a.
Go for it, Parker.
I think you froze.
I think you froze. So while Parker comes back on the call, does anyone else have questions?
Yeah. Hello.
Hey.
You're good.
Hi. I have a general question. It's actually about bylaw 2, so I'm not sure how in depth your guys' knowledge is, but I'm curious. If you're running, like if I was to hypothetically run for a position and somebody else was running as well, are they allowed to, like, not for the same position, are they allowed to be a volunteer on my campaign team? And I know that there are rules against cross campaigning, but I also know that last year, like, senators were like people running for Senate were allowed to be on the campaign team of presidential candidates. And I know because I was one. So.
Yeah. So the key thing with what you just said at the tail end of your question is Senate. So Senate exists in a whole other governance structure. I say we as if it's me. Melissa and her elections team are kind enough to essentially operate the elections on behalf of Western for the student senators. So they follow our rules and they're very much integrated into our process. So that also means, though, that we're not in a position where we're essentially allowed to regulate people from a different organization. Like, we're not able to provide those types of rules for them. We can apply rules within our membership group. So that is like the gray area that makes it weird, because they are so interconnected. I don't know, Melissa or Mark, if you want to add something else there, but that would be the answer to the second part of your question.
Melissa, go for it.
Yeah. So
You're gonna have to just talk for a bit before we can.
I'm gonna just have to talk for a minute. Okay. How about now?
Yeah.
No?
Yeah.
There we go. Okay. For context, if you're listening to this recording, my microphone refuses to pick up the first few things that I say pretty consistently, so I just have to talk for a little bit first. The definition of cross-campaigning that we use in the bylaw and in the violations procedure, what we want to make sure isn't happening is that we want to make sure candidates aren't just pooling their resources and then spending a lot of money or trying to basically get around the spending limits by just producing, having the same platform, combining their resources, and just essentially running as a slate in a non-slate election. So what we want to see happen is that campaigns need to have separate resources. We need to see separate campaign finances. We know that platforms are going to be similar because, if you're consulting students, you're going to hear a lot of the same issues over and over again. So we're not worried about people having similar platforms. What we are worried about is people just, like, say, two candidates getting together and saying, okay, we're going to mutually promote each other and have the same materials and kind of, like I said, run almost like a slate. That's what we're trying to avoid. That's where you're going to get into the gray space. But the session tomorrow morning, if you're able to come or to watch it, or if you want to send questions in, Julia and Kanan are the CRO and DRO. They're going to go into lots of fun detail about what the rules are based on bylaw 2 and our elections policies and procedures.
Okay.
So I guess to answer your question directly in terms of whether or not you're allowed to volunteer, there's nothing that says that you can't, as long as you're not putting yourself into a position where you're kind of getting into that cross-campaigning mode.
Okay. So can I just give you an example and see if that's crossing? So let's say I was running for USC counselor and somebody else was running for the president position, and I wanted to help them. If I put on like my personal Facebook, like, hey, Mark St. Pierre is running for president, he would be great. And then like just leave it at that, like not include my own campaign material, would that be cross campaigning because I'm also running? Or okay, because it's separate, that's fine. Okay.
It's your own personal account, you're fine.
Yeah, I mean, for you specifically, because of your position in the USC, you have like different things. I just got the sign from Nick that I need to keep talking for a little bit. So, keep going. Okay. There we go. All right. You specifically, because of the role you have in the USC, you have other considerations you need to keep in mind. So that is the only thing I will say on that one. But as a general for students broadly, that would be okay.
Yeah. Gotcha. Okay. Okay. Thank you.
What other questions do people have? Well, if there are any, please reach out. We can get contact information on our website if you need it. But happy to answer whatever questions you have about the USC, our governance process, really whatever. Like if you present to any one of us, we don't have the answer to your question, we will find the person who does. It's part of our job. So I will first off end by saying thank you for everyone who did attend and for anyone who's watched us on YouTube. It's fantastic. Governance is not always the most enjoyable, but you'll be surprised how often, if you do get elected to one of these roles, it will change the way you may need to do something next year. So it is important, I would say, but I am the governance guy, so I'm biased.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thanks,
Very
everyone.
well.
Appreciate it.
Nick, you want to just hop on another call? Or do you want to
Yeah, we can. I think there's the link in that.
Okay.
If you want, you're both co-hosts. I can just leave this one and you can stay here.